Hi folks, so Alex and Glenn from LinkedIn. By way of introduction, I'll start off by introducing myself. I've been with LinkedIn now for 10 years. Started off initially as a kind of consultant, advising our clients as to how they can use LinkedIn as a social media platform. Back then, that was like the new thing. Since then, had a few different roles within the business. Advised a lot of our largest search and staffing customers across Europe, the likes of Hayes, Michael Page, Randstad and Adecco, on their overarching strategy. And then more recently moved across to manage part of our enterprise sales business. And so I'm the senior manager within LinkedIn for the UK. I think some of you are our customers. So firstly, thank you for being customers. Appreciate that. And then I'll hand it to Glenn for introductions.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you very much for having us. I started my career in recruitment and then kind of jumped around a couple of different industries before landing in LinkedIn about 8 years ago. Originally on our corporate side, so a lot of my clients were probably a lot of your clients in here, but advising them from a perspective of internal hiring and sourcing and attraction. So I've seen it from that side of the fence, and then made the move across to Alex's team to head up one of the enterprise teams of account directors. So work with a lot of quite ambitious kind of players within the market. So it's not your behemoths of S3 and Michael Page, but it's also not your kind of one-man bands. It's that agile, quite dynamic part of the market. So that's my side. Nice to meet you all today.
Awesome. And that's kind of where we thought about this topic in terms of what we're presenting today. Total Jobs have got an economist, which scared the living life out of me. So we're like, no, we're not going down that route. We're not going to go heavy on the data today. We thought it'd be much more interesting to talk a bit about what's happening in the market from a customer standpoint. So what are we hearing? What are we seeing? What are the things that our clients are currently thinking about as it relates to the market challenges that they're facing? So what we are going to be talking about today is... There we are. What we are talking about today is, very much the key things that are top of mind for recruitment business leaders and different people within the recruitment sector. What it's not going to be is like a heavy data dump. Glenn, any key stats on LinkedIn that you'd like to drop now quickly before we...
Just shy of 1 billion members, 2 new members every second. I don't know what else you want.
So there's a whole bunch of data. We don't want to go through it because that's going to be super boring for you all. But what we want to be able to do is give you the chance to, after this, reach out to us and we can make sure that whatever information or data specific to LinkedIn is interesting to you, i.e. market specificity or industry verticals that are most interesting to you around some of the key trends. Let us know afterwards and we can share something that's more specific and more relevant to you that would hopefully help you to make some business decisions internally. So what very much today is it's a discussion. We're sharing some of the things we're hearing in the trends, but if you agree with them or you disagree with them, let us know. Like, feel free to interject. As Dave said before, like, we're a relatively informal crew. So let's get that conversation going.
Awesome. Is the clicker working?
Yeah,
perfect. Okay, so what keeps the C-suite up at night? So for a while, money has been cheap, opportunity has been abundant, and I think a couple of the key tenets of maybe good bookkeeping and accounting have to some degree fallen to the wayside in these good times. So you think of things like building a cash reserve, profitable growth, managing costs, etc. And so when the market began to change, interest rates rocket up and so on, you start to see that come to the fore again and these kind of key tenets be more and more important. So when Alex and I were talking and trying to synthesize what are we hearing from execs, what are the themes, quite often we noticed that they fell within key tenets of good accounting practices and so on. So we've tried to theme this around that. We've got 4 key areas that we're going to walk you through. And firstly is going to be top line growth. And specifically, so companies thinking about where to drive that investment and that top line growth and when, probably the hardest question of all. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with a story. Does anyone have a clue who this brand is? Please shout out. I'll be very impressed. No one? Okay. So, back in the 1920s, this was the #1, highest selling, biggest brand awareness breakfast cereal in the US. It was everywhere. Every single cupboard you open in any house in the US would have this in. That would be the breakfast cereal of choice. But the 1920s was an interesting time. Does anyone know what happened in the 1920s, the big situation? I'm looking at you, Dave. The Great Depression. Who said that? Spot on. Great Depression. Gigantic, economic contraction. Markets went through the floor. Unemployment rate hit 25% in the US. Brutal.
I hope this isn't a precursor to what's
Yeah. You tell us. So what did Post do? being the market leader, sensible and logical, saw a lot of uncertainty, decided to bunker down. We're going to cut costs, we're going to manage our expenses carefully, but particularly cutting one cost, and that was advertising. Market leader, they had a huge lead on nearest competition, cut that marketing cost right down. And this all happened at the same time of another lesser known competitor in the space. I don't know if anyone knows who that might be. Spot on. Kellogg's. And Kellogg's took a contrarian approach, very different to Post, and saw an opportunity. So Kellogg's did the flip, doubled down, increased its advertising spend by more than twofold. It moved into a space of advertising which was, it sounds funny now, but it was innovative at the time, a new technology being radio, moving away from print, and took that gamble. And it used it as an opportunity to advertise its new cereal. Any guesses what that might be? It wasn't cornflakes, it's Rice Krispies. So you kind of move forward and you start to see the economy recovered bit by bit after this brutal time, but more importantly, the consumer recovered. And what happened here was that you suddenly saw a consumer that had complete brand awareness of Kellogg's, and Post had lost a huge advantage and lead. So it was a story about kind of investing and doubling down in difficult times. But the two things I think are interesting about it, or the lessons to learn from Kellogg's particularly, is they knew where to invest firstly, bless you, where to invest being in this new medium of radio, which at the time would have felt very, very risky, particularly during a depression. And secondly, they knew when to invest, possibly the hardest part. It wasn't when the market had bottomed and everything had improved. It was going into that bottoming process and knowing exactly when. So that brings us on to what we're hearing at the moment, because these kind of conversations or stories are happening right now. And we think, firstly, in terms of where to invest, there's 4 key areas that we're hearing from execs, particularly of these types of firms. So we tried to summarize them. Number 1, hopefully you can see this, is considering investing in verticals. So the part here would be focusing on not just the areas that are largest for these businesses and where the biggest opportunity exists, but where are the most profitable areas. It might be much smaller in your business, but they have much faster growth, much higher rates, etc. Additionally, looking at secular trends. So if we think back to tech 20 years ago, or we think back to oil and gas prior to that, and so on, there are these secular trends that occur. Maybe the next one is AI, who knows? But trying to get ahead of that and position yourself to ask yourself, where does our business want to play in the next 5 or 10 years, not the next 1 year? And lastly, looking to places where competition is less rife. We've seen some huge success stories, places like the space sector, significantly less competition, but gigantic opportunity. So that's one area. Number 2 is geographical spread. Are you in the markets that you want geographically? We've seen a lot of that at the moment. So that can be driven by fees, obviously. So we've seen a lot of focus on the US and expansion out there, whether it's setting up offices or building desks from here. But then also just we all read reports on GDP expectations and which markets are growing, but there are places like APAC that are destined to avoid recession and have huge opportunity ahead of them. So companies really assessing, maybe is this the place we want to be right now and want to be investing in 5 years' time, or do we want to be elsewhere? Number 3, Alex will touch on this a little bit later around innovation, but is the product and service set that they're offering right now where they want to play? So where we've seen this in particular was contingency recruitment, for example, doing work effectively for nothing at times, and asking ourselves, do we want to try and pivot and move away to more retained search? We see, if anyone kind of read the Adecco recent announcement and any of the large players recently, you'll have seen contract has obviously held up quite well in comparison to permanent. So we've seen a lot of our clients in the enterprise space doubling down and trying to establish contractor desks, etc. And then even just more creative things. We've seen recruitment as a service, embedded, etc. But basically asking yourself as a business, is where we're playing right now, is that where we want to be in the coming decade? And if not, how do we start to make those moves to get there? Lastly, and potentially most importantly, is talent and training. So I think about this when I was on the corporate side at LinkedIn, selling directly to businesses for recruitment needs. And the biggest trend would be tech hiring within scale-ups and startups, your likes of the Revolut and TransferWise and all these companies. Huge needs. they would hoover up the talent because of the salaries they could offer, the great work environment, all the other perks that come with all that. And we all saw about a year ago what happened. They started to cut hiring, they really scaled back. But what was interesting, what we saw on our side, was that legacy businesses, your insurance businesses, your banks, your oil and gas, you name it, stepped in and hoovered up all that talent. And it was a huge opportunity for them to steal, market share in that kind of talent pool. So we're starting to see that resonate with our staffing businesses, where you're seeing your peers potentially at times really scaling back or maybe struggling a little bit, and companies asking themselves, is this the time when we can take the best billers and attract them over to our growth story? How do we develop that talent that we bring in? So if we think of, a rising tide lifts all boats. There's been a number of good years recently within this industry, and your learning happens in the tricky times. So companies looking to double down on that training, so that as and when things pick up, their teams are well equipped to excel. So that's the where they're investing. The when is really hard, really, really hard. But there's one thing in particular that we're seeing that we thought was interesting that we'd kind of ask rhetorically to you today. So businesses often look at lagging indicators. It's like just this bias that we have. And in our space, we all know what those look like, and they are important. So we've got things like the unemployment rate. Very, very important for companies like yours, but at the same time, happens after the fact, and we need to be ahead of that. So if you think about internally as well, from a micro level within your businesses, what are the lagging indicators that you have? Maybe it's placements made, maybe it's cash in the bank at the end of the month, etc. Very relevant, but a little bit delayed. So what we're seeing a switch to and more focus on is leading indicators. Let me not block this. So from a macro level, this is numbers of claims on unemployment claims. That's a really good one. It gets ahead of the time. But you have the PMI and the IWM, all these different ones that you can look at around kind of purchasing managers and whether they're positive, etc. They're really good for telling turns in the market early prior to it happening, but it's from a kind of a macro level. So the part we're seeing is internally within your businesses, what are the unique leading indicators you have? For example, businesses sharing with us that increases or decreases in debtor days, a sign that your clients are maybe feeling stress or are starting to feel a little bit more cash loose. Things like first CV to first interview. Certain metrics that only you have within your business, but can foretell a turning point in the market. We have on our side licenses. You'll all probably know about LinkedIn Recruiter licenses. When we see incremental increases in add-on business from licenses, it tells us that businesses are growing. They're hiring headcount, because you're not going to buy a license unless you've got a person there. And we're starting to see those things emerge, which we think is quite interesting. So asking yourself, what are the things within your business that are unique to you that can foretell a turn in the market? So all of these things wrap up around kind of top line growth. Where do you invest, and how do you time this to effectively make the right call on this? I'm going to hand over to you now.
Nice, thanks. Well, one of the points that Glenn just made a moment ago is around that internal visibility of data and access to information within an organization. One of the skills we're seeing that has the fastest growth within the recruitment sector is to do with data and analytics and insights. And so when you look at some of the largest players in the space at the moment, they are hiring more data analysts than ever before. And they are crunching the numbers in everything that organization is doing. They're truly trying to understand what's happening within their CRM systems, within their different databases, within their different parts of their organization, to squeeze that extra bit of value out of whatever is happening within their organization. And that's kind of where it comes on to now, where we talk about managing the bottom line. So Glenn's had the sexy part, right? Growing the top line, making more revenue. I want to talk about the really boring stuff. How do you get more from less? So recruitment organizations are pretty complex beasts, right? There are so many different moving parts. You've got your candidates, your clients, your consultants, macroeconomic conditions that we've just briefly touched on. I'm sure Total Jobs are going to wow us with some stats in a minute around. So we're going to have some more like data to then take into consideration. But there are so many different factors which make up a recruitment business, and understanding those different variables and how do you manage them is really, really tough. And it becomes even more challenging to understand what's going on within your organization, because we have a very binary way of thinking about this concept of return on investment. And when you think about all those different aspects that are happening within your business, all the different macroeconomic environments, your return on investment is harder than ever to manage because you don't kind of know where it's coming from, which is why we need to start pivoting this, have a bit of a mindset shift away from just talking about return on investment. How much money am I spending with a provider or whatever else it might be to get a return? But how am I thinking about my allocation of resources within my business? And this is where the return on resources concept comes from. Originally, again, we're doing a bit of history here. 1977 is where the first use of the term return on resources came about. Again, we're talking about America, unfortunately. They were going through some pretty tough times, and they needed to figure out how they could squeeze more out of the economy. And return on resources was one of the phrases that they started to coin. So what does that mean for recruitment companies? When we think about resources, fundamentally, I guess I'll ask you guys, resources, what goes into a resource, would you say, that generates a return? Anyone? People, yeah. People, systems. What was the? Time. Yep, 100%, yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to resources, there are loads of different things here that we've already touched on, right? Fundamentally, these different aspects of, you can bundle them into like time, technology, and skill. And so people costs, I'm going to chuck that into our skills bucket here, like the skill and talent you have within your business. So there's a difference, right, between a people cost that is a senior recruiter with 10 years worth of experience and a junior grad who's just come on board. The salary expectations are going to be wildly different, yeah? And so actually the cost for that skill is going to be significantly different per person. So these three factors kind of make up what we would define as being resources. How they interplay is super interesting because you might potentially start focusing in on time. How long does it take to perform a specific task or action within our organization? And what level of skill do I require? And what technology do I require in order to change that variable of skill? Or inversely, you might say, I'm going to hire some more senior people. I'm going to hire some data analysts. You mentioned a minute ago, that's a super fast growing skill set. Bring in some data analysts. Maybe they can make my business more efficient. Suddenly I need less time or less technology to develop in this kind of space. But that has a cost of hiring those good people. And then finally, it's like technology. How does technology interplay with these two different factors to either mean that I need less skill in my business or people with a lower level of experience or qualification to be able to deliver that, or maybe even less headcount overall, to be able to do a task in less time? And these different factors are not things that a lot of companies have historically considered, but they need to start moving in this space. And it's really, really important now, specifically as it comes to the emergence of things like AI and the automation that you can have within your business today. Every single person around this table is using AI every single day. And you have got loads of technology within your organizations as they stand today, which will be AI-powered or data-centric. And most of you don't know how they work or how to get the most out of them. And that is a massive, massive missed opportunity. So when we talk to people like CRM providers and ATS providers around the space, the number one thing they're doing at the moment is training people as to how they can get the most out of what they've already got because there's so much goodness in it. And I would say, take time today to figure out within your business, like what is that technology actually doing and how much time and effort and skill and overall cost are you potentially going to be saving through implementing things in the right way. So getting more with less starts with just really understanding what you've already got. And how can you reduce that skill level and time to generate revenues within your business? So just a few things here to consider when it comes to this mind shift space, right? So it's not just about the money you're spending to generate the results. It's also around the skill, technical abilities that go into that process and the associated costs with each of those different things. How do you manage those variables? What's the time it takes to yield these results? And finally, when you're measuring technology and tools, I know it's super challenging, but you need to start figuring out like what lever is this potentially pulling? If I'm going to buy a new thing, what's it actually going to physically change around the skill I need with my organization or the time it takes to perform a certain action? And yeah, could these tasks have been done in this time frame without access to those tools, technology, or information in that first instance? So that's thinking about like how do we manage the bottom line. The next part is around actually, and Glenn touched on it earlier, right? It's around thinking, are we creating enough value in our marketplace? And when we talk about the marketplace, it means clients, it means candidates, it means consultants, and I'm very aware that within the recruitment sector, a lot of CEOs and founders have aspirations to at some point retire to a beach somewhere and sip cocktails. So there's that idea of like, what do I need to do to make sure that investors like our organization or future acquisitions think that we're an attractive proposition? So that's really where it needs to create that unique value within your organization. So how can we do this? It's a bit complicated, but this might give you a few different ideas, okay? So I said before, I joined LinkedIn 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I know, I don't know that old. I know I joined LinkedIn 10 years ago, and when I first joined, loads of our customers were talking about this idea of reactive sourcing. I'm going to speak to someone, I'm going to say, hey, have you got any jobs? And they're going to say, yeah, and then I'm going to get that job, and then I'm going to fill that job. That's like super reactive sourcing. And then there's organizations that are thinking a bit more strategically about the way in which they practice their recruiting methodologies. They're thinking about pipelining beforehand. There are other organizations that are moving into consulting spaces where they're trying to add extra value to their customers, whatever that means. But they're in there, they're consulting, they're trying to give some more guidance and advice. And finally, on the far right-hand side, in terms of ability capabilities within the recruitment sector, there are organizations, believe it or not, that are strategic partners to their end customers, are thinking more specifically about talent management and mapping their markets effectively, building on auxiliary services, and are truly consulting within their space. We mentioned things like embedded talent a moment ago. If you look at the US market today, the fastest growing recruitment business is actually a bit of technology that just matches candidates in the nursing sector. And that is the fastest growing business. It's a bit of technology that just does all the work. And so when we start thinking about productization of recruitment businesses, like what are we doing today to create a product that's interesting to our candidates, our clients, and potential future investors? Interestingly enough, no, I won't say that. I'll give you a good hint. So anyway, there was a recruitment business recently that was, I say recently, about 2 years ago, that was acquired in the legal space. And the multiple that organization went for was more than double the average multiple within the recruitment sector. So the average recruitment company goes for like 8 times EBIT, right? Roughly. This went for about 16 to 18 times. No one knows exactly, apart from people who got those checks. But somewhere between 16 times EBIT. And the reason they went for so much is because they position themselves as primarily a technology business that happened to do recruiting. Fundamentally, it's a recruitment business that just had good kit in the background. But the way in which they positioned themselves to their markets meant that they were able to add this extra value. So I've told you a bit of like a wild story here, yeah? And I've given you 4 different chunks of the market, very general. By a show of hands, who is currently sitting in that reactive sourcing bucket today? Anyone still in that reactive sourcing bucket? Have you got any jobs? I'll go fill that job. Anyone? No? No show of hands? Good. Times are changing. Lovely. Sourcing and pipelining, always pipelining, constantly tapping into specific markets, have a really clear, direct channel of candidates coming in consistently within that space. Raise of hands. Who sits in that bucket? Yeah, a couple, yeah. Cool. Good. And then maybe potentially who are moving more into this consulting space, adding extra value. Maybe they're thinking about different ways in which they can bring knowledge to their customers in that market. Also, yeah, a few. Cool. Yeah. And who's confident in being strategic partners to their customers at the moment and really deep in there, right, properly adding extra value and think about new auxiliary services. Cool. Okay. So we've got a nice little balance here across the board. Fundamentally, most of the people I speak to, or most of the people we speak to on a day-to-day basis, tend to fit somewhere in the middle, right? In the middle of that bell curve. Good news, most people here sort of fit in the middle of that bell curve as well, right? Not a super surprise. That's good, right? In so much as that we're not behind the curve, but it also means that we're in a super saturated space. And there are so many recruitment companies who are kind of doing the same stuff as us. So how do we differentiate ourselves within this market? Fundamentally, it's about a mind shift, right? Again, going back to the idea of a mind shift. But how do we move ourselves from talking about access to candidates or talent and moving more into this conversation around insight? How do we deliver better insight to our end customers and to our marketplace? And how do we play in this space as a true consultative organization? And that's really where you start to generate that extra return on investment, not only through the placements you're making, but the auxiliary services you're selling. And then fundamentally, if someone does come to invest in your organization, the valuation goes up quite dramatically as well. Yeah. And so hopefully that makes sense. Does that make sense, more or less? A few nodding heads? Okay, cool. Good. So that kind of leads me on to Glenn and managing risk.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to do a show of hands as well with this one. Hands up who thinks it's a riskier environment today as a business than it were when it was 3 years ago. Okay, fair enough. A nice mix. Okay, so our perception of risk is really fascinating because it completely changes our time horizons. And this is absolutely something that execs are thinking about right now. So I'm going to try and take you back, unfortunately, to this time, 2020. We all remember this image, probably not in the best of light. And we think back to 2020 and what happened. I'm just going to stand over here so I'm not blocking everyone. Think back to 2020 and what happened. It was a complete standstill at one point. Furlough schemes, I would say peak uncertainty for a lot of people. Are we going to have a job? Where's the world going? Dave and I were talking about commodities a second ago. Oil went negative because people weren't traveling. People thought, we're not going to use this anymore. And our whole time horizon really shrunk, I think, for most people. And it was difficult to see beyond a certain number of days or weeks or months. And we shifted to this me, here, right now kind of mindset. We became risk averse suddenly. We extrapolated that pessimism really out into the distance and struggled to make those long-term decisions. I think most people felt that way. Fast forward to not too long after, 2021, and I think we all look back on that kind of moment to some degree positively, especially from a market point of view. We suddenly had a generational opportunity in the labour markets. We saw recruitment businesses, our clients, making fortunes, doing better than ever before, breaking records. And you saw a time horizon shift. We saw it as sellers to those businesses. Their time horizons changed. You suddenly went from being very, very narrow and couldn't see beyond the next few months to, the future is bright. We go to me, there, then mindset. Our risk appetite suddenly opens up, and suddenly we extrapolate that optimism indefinitely into the future. And we then take one more step forward, and we land today in 2023 with our friend Mr. Bailey, who has changed the market dramatically. Interest rates significantly higher than they have been for generations. And suddenly a market that I would say, at least from our perspective, is really bifurcated. It's not one thing or the other, and there's a lot of guesswork going around it. So we have clients in one side of this market that are feeling very much in that 2021 mindset. It is me, there, then, positive. We can take long-term decisions. We're going to steal market share. Now is our time. And then we have the complete opposite. And we have clients who are very much in the 2020 mindset of me here now. Time horizon's very narrow. I'm risk averse, etc. So the interesting thing with all this is that risk, if you've got any scientists in the room, you know that energy never dies, right? It just transfers, just moves. Risk is the same. In the financial markets, Dave, we were talking before about this, but it doesn't end. It just moves around the place. And so that risk hasn't gone away. But what execs seem to be focused on now is how do we consider our time horizons effectively in an environment where risk was pronounced and we're aware of it. So there are three things that we're seeing. I mean, there's a lot of things, but there's three things that we can summarize that we're seeing at the moment with this. And that is, number one, based on this chap. Does anyone have a clue? If anyone gets this, I'm very, very impressed. Forget about the Kellogg's one. Anyone know who this is? It's this person is called Harry Markowitz. It's not going to help anyone, is it?
Finance.
Spot on. We owe your award, LinkedIn swag after this. So, a very niche reference, but this person created something that we are all accustomed to, especially as business owners. You are experts in this or thinking through this. And he created this idea of diversification, effectively. He was a finance type bod. He won the Nobel Prize for this, and it was about diversifying when you're investing so that you don't have all your eggs in one basket. It's a phrase we all know. We all kind of live by it to some degree, but this person pioneered it. This phrase or this term of diversification has been one that we've heard constantly over the last year or so, and particularly pronounced in the last 6 months. And it comes in a number of different areas, but three in particular that spring to our mind. So one is client diversification, asking yourself and companies assessing, are we over-indexed, over-leveraged to one particular client? Does 70% of our business come from this one business? There's a huge risk there. Companies looking to diversify away from that and double down on BD. We have consultant risk. Can be depending on the size of the business, but there can be huge amounts of concentration in the number of consultants. If they were to leave the business, they're suddenly exposed dramatically. And we know in tough times, consultants take their laptop, head off, and often set up these businesses. So it's a time to kind of spread that risk. And then lastly, the diversification in product. So without a doubt, like a move away from, certain old forms of recruitment with contingency into other areas, trying new streams, but trying to manage that. So if the market turns, they're ready to adapt. Secondly is data. The C-suite, Alex mentioned it a second ago, but having access not just to data, data's irrelevant, it has to be relevant data that is high fidelity, data you can trust. So we talked about the leading indicators before, and unique indicators for your business that you're going to trust much more than a top-line macro indicator that could be relevant for everyone but not necessarily for you. So companies really investing in how do you scrutinize, how do their exec team scrutinize data? How do you get team leads to look at the data? What KPIs do you use? And how does everyone have a data-led approach to this? And that can go all the way to investing in the business and deciding to double down on headcount, all the way through to, how efficient are my teams, et cetera. Are we looking at the data? Are we fishing where the fish are, et cetera? And then lastly, is more around this piece of execution. So from a data point of view, this is then taking that and thinking through key topics such as ROI and scenario planning specifically. So in the good times, like we talked about before, 2021, our time horizon extends and we can only see the good. And so we think about upside. We'll think about an investment and we'll think, how far can it go for my business? What can I get off the back of that? If I hire this person, how much could they deliver? In bad times, it's the opposite. It's if I hire this person and it doesn't work, what happens? So what we're seeing now is a more balanced approach, which is positive, but scenario planning. How do you scenario plan investments, decisions across your business? And most importantly, and something we've all learned over the last few years, is how do you stay agile to pivot? If you see an opportunity, how do you turn your business towards that? And a very brief example, we've seen a lot in the last couple of years, there was a big pivot in blockchain. Kind of finance recruiters seeing a huge opportunity within the blockchain space, noticing it's a very small part of their business at the moment, but has a huge potential, and pivoting very quickly to put resource behind that to try and grow it. So those are three of the key things that we're hearing consistently. I'm conscious of the time here, so we maybe try and wrap this up.
Yep.
So we talked around top-line growth first of all. We know that is around where do you invest in that top-line growth and when. And we use that story of Kellogg's to bring that example of sometimes it's not always in the good times, so sometimes that's too late. And Alex?
Yeah, managing the bottom line. Badly run businesses in good times can do fine. Badly run businesses in bad times, slightly more challenging. And then, around creating unique value for your business. So just make sure that you're thinking strategically about where you're positioning yourself in that market space. The UK is an incredibly saturated market. It is very complex. Make sure that the auxiliary services and the solutions you're providing to your customers actually stand out and set you in good stead for candidates, consultants, clients, and potentially investors.
And then lastly, managing risk. So this can be from all different angles, whether it be consultant risk, client concentration, product risk, etc. But asking those questions and scenario planning effectively so that you are positioned for success. I think that's pretty much everything. So thank you very much for listening. Good guesses on everything there. Well done. We owe some bottles of champagne and LinkedIn swag.
Whoa.
Yeah. Need to manage that risk.
But thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thanks.